Let's continue to break down the basics of effective writing by taking a look at essentials of writing by two different categories of punctuation. We'll also look at dependent clauses, independent clauses, as well as identifying and correcting multiple forms of fragments. So first let's talk about essentials of writing. There are two different categories when it comes to punctuation. The first is between sentence punctuation. There are three types of between sentence punctuation. You're looking at a period, a question mark, an exclamation point. Most students are going to know how to effectively use different types of between sentence punctuation. Students are going to know when they have a pure statement and need to use a period. Students are going to know when they're asking a question and they need to use a question mark. I think there is a bit of confusion in regard to using and how to use an exclamation point, and I'll give you a hint that most times in academic writing, students are not going to use an exclamation point. It is a bit too emotional for academic writing, and it can convey a different message than what you're trying to send to your professor. I strongly recommend and honestly see that most students, 95% of the time, primarily use a period unless they come across using a question or asking a question and thus use a question mark. I usually tell students to shy away from using an exclamation point, which at times can be difficult because, of course, through text messaging and social media, we want to be as emotional as possible. We have to make a break between what is social media interface and what's actually college level writing. So I tell students, unless you're expressing intense emotion, really stay away from exclamation points. The second category for punctuation is within sentence punctuation, and examples of that are going to be a comma, a semicolon, dashes, parentheses. Honestly, most students, this is where they have the most difficulty. They are inappropriately putting commas just excessively throughout their essays because they don't know where they go. They are unable to be able to see the coordinating conjunctions, dependent clauses, and things that we're going to continue to talk about and improve upon as we evolve our writing skill. But that's okay that we are evolving our writing skill. The intent is to be able to evaluate, set some boundaries of guidelines for grammatical structure, and make a concerted effort to improve those pieces. As you can see here, the example given is Mary lost her keys this morning, comma, but found them this afternoon. In last week's lesson, we looked at coordinating conjunctions, and a coordinating conjunction is the acronym fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And we used one of those acronym words, and we are separating two independent thoughts, so thus we're using a comma. So these are the rules that we're talking about as you're doing your reinforcement activities in My Skills Lab. So let's talk about a dependent clause. A dependent clause is a group of words that cannot stand by itself. If left alone, it makes a fragment, which is a major and honestly a very common grammar error. Many times a dependent clause is missing a subject or verb, or it's just not conveying a complete thought or idea. So here are some examples. Although a person can go weeks without food, the subject is in blue, the verb is in orange. You can see that there is a subject and there is a verb, but it's not conveying its entirety of idea. The complete thought is not conveyed here. A secondary example, whether a person can go or not. Again, a subject and verb is conveyed. It's just not a complete thought. And the last is, and moved to her new home. And again, subject and a verb, it is just not a complete sentence. We're actually just not getting enough information from these pieces to fully convey a complete thought. I usually tell my students, in order to be able to remember a dependent clause, you have to understand we as students and we as adults, we want to be independent. And if you are independent, you can stand on your own 2 feet. If you're dependent, you depend on somebody or something else to assist you. A dependent clause is similar. A dependent clause depends on more information to make it a complete thought. And if you are writing fragments, which are typically dependent clauses, you are establishing sentences that are not giving enough information or do not have a sentence subject or the appropriate verb that belongs to the subject that's going on. In opposite of what we just spoke about, there is the independent clause. An independent clause is very straightforward. It's a group of words that can stand by itself to make a complete sentence. In the examples here, he didn't go to class today. They worked the same shift at work. So it is very clear cut. These are simple sentences here. Obviously, if I had more complex or compound sentences, it may be a little bit more difficult to tell, but we would read it structurally for what it was. If you're able to, again, what we did last week, parts of speech, is we identified prepositional phrases to make sure that the sentence had a true subject and that object or subject was not connected to the prepositional phrase. Did the sentence have a true verb? If it started with a subordinating conjunction, which was the step 4, if it started at the beginning of the sentence, it was a dependent clause that started it. So we'll get more into that here in just a bit. So let's get directly into fragments. What is it? Fragments, it's extremely common. I see fragments many times for students improving and evolving their writing skill, and we just have to, as academic writers, we have to slow down and be able to read each sentence for exactly what it is. And so these fragments can seriously affect the meaning of your writing. And so again, as I stated earlier, fragments are known as dependent clauses. That means, again, a dependent clause depends on more information, whether that be a subject, verb, or additional information, in order to convey the complete thought. Readers care about fragments because, without that verb or subject, they don't know what the action of the sentence is or who performs that action. And so here's an example. This is a fragment. Going to the bookstore to get my textbooks. The first question in your head is like, well, who went to the bookstore? And so you would correct it by being able to put that subject. So fixing a fragment that's missing a subject, that's pretty straightforward. Typically if there's a problem with a fragment subject, it's simply that the students have left it out. This does happen oftentimes as students, many times it's usually they're telling a story, and let's say that we have many different characters within that story, and what will happen is students lose sight of who they're actually talking about in these sentences because everybody's like crammed together. Well, if a student cannot convey appropriately who the subject and the action happening to that subject within the sentence, if it's not being conveyed on the writer's side, the reader is not getting it. And honestly, likely they're having difficulty being able to say, okay, well, they introduced all these different names and characters, or we or they, and really who is the actual subject that's being conveyed here? So, without that subject, students do not have a complete sentence. And so here's an example of how to fix a fragment missing a subject. So here's the example. Interesting to compare the two readings. And to fix that, I've used the pronoun it. It is interesting to compare the two readings. I could have stated a person's name. I could have revised the entire sentence based off of, what was really happening beyond this, or just fixing this one sentence in itself. So you've got to be able to evaluate who or what is the action, the verb, happening to someone, something, some object that belongs to that sentence. Now sometimes sentences have words that look like verbs, but the verb is not actually complete, or it isn't actually a verb at all. The two most common problems with verbs are using an ing verb all by itself or using the to form of the verb. Watch out for words ending in ing that they look like verbs, but they're not complete on their own. If they don't have a helping verb, then the sentence is not actually complete. Also look for to verbs which are in their infinitive form and can't work as the main verb of the sentence. So here are two examples. The waiter carefully balancing several plates on the way back to the kitchen. Can the waiter really balancing? No, he was balancing, or maybe he balanced. You need to either add a helping verb to make the verb complete, or turn balancing into a verb on its own. And so here we added a helping verb to be able to convey appropriately what was really happening, the action happening here. So another example is my history professor to return exams today. Is there a verb here? In the sentence, the to return, it seems like a verb, it seems like an action, but the to form can never be the verb. You either need to add a verb to the sentence or change the to form of the verb. So what I've done is I have added a verb. I said, my history professor promised to return our exams today. Here we're fixing fragments that are incomplete thoughts. An incomplete thought is also known as a cliffhanger. This type of fragment occurs when the idea or thought, it's just not complete. And honestly, most fragments really kind of exist in this realm. These fragments may look a lot like sentences, because they may have the subject, they may have the verb, but they do not complete a thought. They're cliffhangers. They leave us needing more information. This kind of fragment has several variations. The cliffhangers might be a phrase adding information to another sentence, or beginning with a preposition or a subordinator. With these kinds of fragments, it's often easiest to look at the sentence before or after the fragment to figure out, what's missing. In some cases, the cliffhanger fragments, it may need both a subject and a verb. Like in the following example. I actually gave an example here. It says, Carlos wanted to do well during his first semester at college. Next sentence, wishing he had more time to study. Well, remember, each sentence has to stand on its own. It's got to be an independent thought. And so the first sentence sufficiently meets that need. It stands on its own. But then when you get to the next sentence, it doesn't. If I just said alone, wishing he had more time to study, you're wondering, well, who is wishing? I know it says he, but it just doesn't quite make sense. So here we just revised it to say, he wished he had more time to study to be able to fix that. There are several variations to be able to fix this. I could have combined with the sentence before. I could have said Carlos was wishing he had more time to study. Several different variations, but you've got to be able to make sure that you have that information and it makes a complete thought. And finally, there are other, not as common, but still important information and fragment errors. Sometimes fragments can be related to the way students structure their sentences and unfortunately misidentify the sentence subject or the verb. So there can be fragments that begin with prepositions. So here's an example. The author starts off making an argument. That sentence is fine. Then it goes on to say, for increasing the number of healthy snacks available to school kids who are currently at the mercy of fast food manufacturers. Now, the second sentence here, which is in orange, and I've underlined the preposition because the word for is a preposition, this cannot stand on its own. It just does not truly convey a subject. It's got several verbs in there, it's got objects in there, but those pieces actually belong to preposition phrases. This is why we did what we did last week when we were looking at parts of speech. You've got to identify preposition phrases so you can determine, do those subjects actually belong to the sentence or do they belong to the preposition phrase? Likely the best correction to this particular error is to remove the period after the word argument, lowercase the f for, and combine the two sentences together. An easy fix, but you've got to be able to recognize these pieces. Another type of fragment is one that begins with subordinating conjunction. Here's this word that keeps popping up. If a sentence begins with a subordinating conjunction, these are common subordinating words such as after, although, anywhere, as, because, before, even. The list just kind of goes on, and I'll put a link inside of Blackboard so that you can reference those key subordinating and common subordinating conjunction words because you've got to become familiar with them. If a sentence begins with a subordinating conjunction, it should automatically tell you as a writer that you're beginning a sentence with a dependent clause. And a rule of thumb stands. If you begin a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, which is a dependent clause, you have to have a comma. You have to. I mean, it's a standing rule. All right? So here's an example. It says, unless there is a great demand for it, period. That alone, we cannot leave a sentence just like that. I don't believe it conveys much of anything. I don't even believe that there's no subject in here at all, and it's an incomplete thought. So it's kind of a violation on multiple terms of a fragment. The word unless is a subordinating conjunction. This tells you automatically it's a dependent clause. And what that should further tell you is for punctuation purposes, instead of there being a period after the word it, needs to be a comma. It needs to be a comma. Lowercase the t and make that one complete thought. So it would read as such. Unless there's a great demand for it, the school district won't improve the snacks or lunches it provides for students. Now, pulling the dependent clause and the independent clause successfully into a sentence together with appropriate punctuation is a beautiful thing. And so the last piece is looking at fragments that add additional information, such as who, like, when, and which. And so here's an example. Cosmetic ads especially appeal to teens. Then it goes on to a new sentence and says, who might feel insecure about their appearance? Now remember, if each sentence has to stand on its own, the first sentence is fine. It may not give a ton of information and is considered a simple sentence, but it can still stand on its own. But the second sentence in here, and it's italicized and in orange, it is who is who. I mean, I don't need to rely on the sentence before to make this sentence stand on its own. You've got to see that you've got to pull these two together. And so, very similar to, I can actually pull these sentences together and say cosmetic ads especially appeal to teens. Remove the period, lowercase the w, and then go forward. So all together it would read, cosmetic ads especially appeal to teens who might feel insecure about their appearance. There is no comma there because the word cosmetic is not a subordinating conjunction. This first sentence is not a dependent clause, so I'm not held to having a comma which separates the independent and dependent clauses. So what I want students to do, I understand this is an evolving writing process. You're learning new concepts and new terms and how to be able to fix your writing. So we need to be able to continue to practice, identifying fragments and fixing fragments. So I have set up multiple activities inside of my skills lab specifically related to fragments for this week. Students are responsible to get in, take care of those assignments. They will be due on June 30th.